I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Non-muscle invasive bladder cancer is a common, slow-progressing form of bladder cancer that makes up a majority of the roughly 500,000 new cases diagnosed each year. For decades, doctors have relied on a weakened bacterium called BCG in intravesical immunotherapy as a standard treatment for early-stage disease, but it fails in about 30 to 40% of patients. EnGene is taking a different approach with detalimogene, an experimental non-viral gene therapy designed to trigger a powerful but localized immune response right where the cancer lives in the bladder. We spoke with Ron Cooper, CEO of EnGene, about this therapy for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, how its dual payload is meant to activate both an innate and adaptive immune response in the bladder, and the company's $130 million financing at the end of 2025. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
We're going to talk about non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, EnGene, and its efforts to develop the first non-viral gene therapy for bladder cancer. Let's start with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. What is it?
So, Danny, non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, or otherwise called NMIBC, is a form of bladder cancer that, when you think about it, it's confined to the inner lining of the bladder and hasn't grown into the bladder muscle as yet. It's a pretty common cancer. It's the sixth most common by incidence. And, when you look at bladder cancer overall, the totality of bladder cancer, non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, NMIBC, is the vast majority, about 75 to 85% of it. And when you think about, cancers and different types of cancers, the way to think about NMIBC, this is sort of a slow progressing type of cancer. So these patients go through a multi-year journey.
And how does it typically manifest itself and progress?
So the early signs are usually blood that's found in the urine or urinary symptoms that are confused with the UTI. So discomfort. Most NMIBC patients are predominantly male. They're probably in their mid 70s. They're often individuals, that are smokers. And then what happens is, a urologist will investigate. If they see any suspicious tissue, they'll surgically remove that. But as I said, this is a multi-year journey. So the disease itself progresses slowly, about 20%, over 10 years is the progression towards the muscle invasive version of bladder cancer.
And what's the prognosis for someone diagnosed with the condition today, and what treatment options exist?
So NMIBC is a slow disease, but it's a serious disease, right? Particularly if the disease progresses to muscle invasive or metastatic disease. And so because it's a slow disease, it's a pretty high burden on the patients, and there are not that many treatment options. So as I said before, you start with being diagnosed with some discomfort or some blood in the urine, maybe a resection of some tumors. And then patients are often start with the first line standard care treatment called Bacillus calmette-guerin, or BCG for short. Now, BCG is an effective product. However, there are a couple of things that are a real challenge with it. Number one, it's been on back order for almost a decade in the United States, right? And two, as you take more of it, you land up with poor tolerability. It's hard to take over time. Now, unfortunately, about half of those patients in a couple of years will experience a recurrence, right? or progression of the disease. And then, they would be considered to be BCG unresponsive. Right? So then what are the options from there? There are some medical options, but ultimately, if the disease is progressing, a patient is subject to what's called a radical cystectomy, which is removal of the bladder. And this is a pretty big surgery. It has both a high morbidity and mortality rate. From a morbidity perspective, these patients lose their prostate. They land up with an ostomy bag. So that's not great from a quality of life perspective. But also mortality is, somewhere between 5 to 15%. So, NMIBC is a long progressing disease, but it is a heavy duty disease to have.
EnGene's lead experimental therapy is detalimogene, which uses a non-viral vector. What is the vector and what is the cargo?
Yeah, it's really interesting product, detalimogene. So when you think normally of viral gene therapies have limitations. One, you can't. You're limited about the cargo. You can't redose them, and they are very expensive to manufacture. Detalimogene is made with really interesting proprietary technology called the dually derived oligochitosan platform, or DDX. So that's a fancy way of saying we've got a proprietary synthetic sugar-based polymer that actually facilitates the cellular uptake, right? So the product itself is non-viral, it's non-immunogenic, and we're already manufacturing it at scale. And since it's non-viral and non-immunogenic, it really helps us avoid some of the handling and safety headaches with the viral therapies, and it's much more cost efficient. So the product itself, the way to think of it, it's a simple plasmid DNA that has two RIG I agonists plus IL-12. It's combined with the proprietary sugar and it's pegylated. And this product has an impact on both the innate and adaptive pathways. So it's a pretty elegant product.
And in terms of the payload, this has a dual payload. Is that correct?
That is correct. It is a dual payload, and it's able to engage both the innate and adaptive pathways. So the product itself is administered into the bladder intravesically, right? So you bathe the bladder, and in bathing the bladder, what we're able to do is take these two double-stranded RNAs. So that was the RIG I that I talked about, plus the cytokine IL-12, right? So this kind of gives a 1-2 punch, and then the DDX itself, the synthetic sugar, facilitates the uptake. So the nice thing about this, Danny, is that you have a very local therapy. You don't really have much in the way of systemic exposure. So what you get is the benefit of what we've seen is really promising efficacy, but also a terrific safety profile. And then because it's a non-viral approach, it's also easily manufactured and handled.
You're able to engage both the adaptive and innate immune system. Does that help avoid the development of resistance?
Well, I think in many ways it does, right? Because what we have is a product that is redosable as well, right? So when you think about resistance, in this case, it's a little bit different to think about it, right? So in the disease of NMIBC, what you have are patients that are recurring, right? If they have a treatment, they may get their disease again. And that's what happens with BCG, for instance. The real issue is if they progress. So if they progress, these patients then progress to muscle invasive or onto metastatic disease, which is really terrible, right? So detalimogene, because it works in a local way, and it has a powerful anti-tumor immune response, And since it has these three ingredients, right, it then has an impact on both the innate and adaptive pathways. So the thinking behind that is you land up with memory, you have an immediate impact, and you also have a lasting impact.
There's certainly been a move towards the use of combination therapies. Are you looking at this in combination with other medicines, or does the fact that it does have these dual cargoes sort of act like a combination therapy?
Well, in some ways it does, right? Because we really love the efficacy profile of detalimogene in some of our preliminary data. And because it's intravescular, the side effect profile seems to be attractive as well. But if you look at the products that are approved in NMIBC, they all have about a 12-month, 20 to 40% CR rate, complete response rate. So what does that mean? That means that in a year, 60 to 80% of the patients are recurring. So the need for new medicines is really important, right? And these products in the future will be sequenced one after another. But you could make the argument to say, well, rather than sequencing, what if we gave them together? Could we get a higher 12-month complete response rate? And that's where detalimogene could be kind of interesting because there's a number of products that are in the same category. And so you can't combine products in the same category. It doesn't make any sense. But detalimogene, because it's a non-viral approach, it can be combined with chemo. It can be maybe potentially combined with other therapies. And if you put them together, perhaps you could land up with a higher complete response rate and really keep these patients away, from progressing or recurring.
And how is detalimogene delivered, and how targeted or localized are its effects?
Well, it's super targeted and super local. So detalimogene is a lyophilized powder. You put water and mix that lyophilized powder. You then take detalimogene and put it into a catheter, and that catheter is inserted in the urethra of the patient. So as I indicated earlier, then you bathe the bladder, and with low amount, only 50 mils, right? So you bathe the bladder, and remember, this is NMIBC, so this is a cancer of the inner lining per se of the bladder. So that's where these carcinoma in situ um, cancerous cells are. So by bathing the bladder with detalimogene, you have a very local effect. And right now, our early data shows some pretty good, very competitive efficacy levels with a low AE profile. So very targeted, very efficacious thus far in development.
What's known about it from the studies you've conducted to date?
So, detalimogene right now is being studied in what's called the Legend program. And within the Legend program, we have one cohort, which is the pivotal cohort. And within that, we shared some preliminary data recently. And the first thing to note is that detalimogene demonstrated a 63% complete response rate at any time. This is the primary endpoint for approval. But in addition, it demonstrated a 56 complete response rate at 3 months and a 62% response rate at 6 months. Um, and what was interesting is some patients who didn't respond at the 3 month time frame actually responded a little bit later, which kind of speaks to that um, immunotherapy impact that I was talking about earlier. Now, we don't have a lot of patients that have gone beyond that 6 month point, but we really have a handful of patients, 5 patients who were eligible for a 9 month assessment and completed those assessments, and they were complete responders as well. So, as I said before, the efficacy profile of detalimogene is emerging, but it's looking like a very nice competitive efficacy profile.
And what's the development path forward?
So what's terrific about detalimogene is that we are currently in a pivotal study. So detalimogene is within the Legend program. It is cohort one, and cohort one is fully enrolled. We over enrolled that with 125 patients. The last patients should finish about their 12-month time frame in around the fall of next year. And then we anticipate filing the BLA with the FDA shortly after that.
Your platform technology has the potential to deliver RNA and DNA to mucosal tissue. This suggests it may have value for delivering therapies to the intestines or lungs as well as other sites. Is there a pipeline beyond detalimogene, and how are you thinking about prioritizing indications if you look beyond this program?
Well, absolutely. It's very elegant technology. As I said before, being a non-viral approach, it lends itself to many other, diseases and other parts of the body. To be honest, though, we're very focused in making sure that we execute on our plan with detalimogene and get detalimogene to the market as quickly as possible. At the same time, though, we continue to do experiments that advance the platform, and we're hopeful of making some progress there, and look forward to updating individuals as we identify candidates and move them towards the clinic.
So, as you think about it, additional indication, are there criteria you're using?
Like at any point of when we think about products, right? We first of all start with what is the unmet medical need, number one, right? Number two, is our product differentiated? And number three, can we design a product to meet the needs of that particular customer group? In the case of urologists, when we thought about detalimogene, most of these NMIBC patients are in community urologists. And so what did we need to do to design detalimogene? We needed a product that had efficacy or competitive efficacy profile. We needed a product that would be well tolerated, generally well tolerated, because we want patients to actually continue on therapy. But also three, we needed something that was easy for both the physician and the patients, right? So that the product fit very nicely into the practice dynamics, and also for the patient, it just wasn't, that difficult to take. You didn't have to take it very often. So that was the design principle behind detalimogene. And if we advance anything else from our pipeline, those are the types of things we think about.
Company completed a $130 million public offering in November. How far will existing cash take you?
Well, we're well capitalized as a company, and we have cash into the second half of 2028, which should get us past a number of important milestones, including filing of the BLA and the in the second half of 26, and a potential approval in 2027.
You've been in this industry for about 30 years. You were previously the CEO at Alberio Pharma, which you took public, raised substantial capital for, and ultimately sold to Ipsen for about $1 billion. How do you view the current environment for a biotech in terms of raising capital or making deals?
Well, yeah, it has been a biotech winter for a number of years where the XBI has, taking a complete pounding, and it has been difficult, I think, for all of us in biotech. However, I think the current environment, it looks very promising. XBI has rebounded. There's been a number of follow-on offerings, that have occurred. There's been a number of M&A transactions, which I think has helped a lot. And now you're actually seeing IPOs in our space. So I'm feeling very confident. I feel it's a great opportunity for companies like EnGene and for other biotechs, that are trying to advance important new medicines.
Or what are your conversations with investors like these days, and what concerns them most? Have you noticed a shift as the market for biotech stocks has improved?
Let me start with the shift part of things. I think in the first half of 25, I think the market was pausing for a bit, and the market for us is a complicated one because how the larger companies, the strategics go, uh, often impacts biotech. And I think the strategics were trying to get their heads around, the impact of tariffs, the impact of MFM, the continued impact of IRA. And I think once they started to really understand how that would impact their business and the long-term prospects, it started to have them think about addressing their biggest problem. Their biggest problem is some large patent cliffs. So I think in the second half of the year, as the year progressed, you saw a number of really great M&A transactions. And those M&A transactions, I think, have really fueled the market and have allowed follow-ons and as I indicated earlier, potential IPOs. As it relates to EnGene specifically, we have seen a shift in the thinking, and really, I think there are three big themes that have been coming up. First of all, the clinical robustness that we're starting to see, with detalimogene. What we're seeing is that investors have been pretty excited about our preliminary data showing that we have a real competitive profile and how that compares to others. The second thing that we're seeing a shift in is, now that, there's been some issues in regards to the regulatory path and how and what's been happening with execution with some other companies. But, we see other agents being approved during the special regulatory path that we have. And people have been very focused on our interactions with the FDA and how we've received both Fast Track, the RMAT designation, the CMC pilot program, CDRP, and how that impacts our BLA filing timeline of 2026. And I think the third thing that investors have started to look at is just the commercial reality of these new products, really understanding that it's not one product that's going to win, right? That it's multiple products as doctors sequence these, and that in fact the community urologist is where the business is going to be, and that when we think about community urologists, they think about really three parameters in an equal way: efficacy, tolerability, and ease of use, and how that fits into their practice. Whereas the academics think more probably about efficacy, and then that the profile of detalimogene, the competitive efficacy profile, being generally well tolerated and probably the easiest product to both administer and receive for the patient. That profile has become very competitive. So been a dynamic year from a market perspective. We've seen shifts in the market. We've seen shifts in the perception of EnGene.
Ron Cooper, CEO of EnGene. Ron, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.